Okay. Can you hear me well? Because I'm very soft-spoken. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. The first thing that I'm going to do, actually, is to introduce to you. Wait, maybe it will have to happen at the end. But I want to introduce to you our distinguished panelists. I will do so at the end so that you can see their pictures and know who each one of them is, no? But we have 2 representatives of the public sector, 2 representatives of the private sector in the Caribbean, a 3rd representative from a banking institution in the Caribbean, and another representative of a regional investment promotion agency. Okay, so the topic of this panel is investment climate, and what I'm going to present to you are the main challenges and policy solutions that were identified by the CGF national action plans. The purpose of these thematic panels are that the panelists provide feedback to what is presented in the presentations so that the national working groups can incorporate that feedback during the subgroups that will take place starting at 2:30, okay? Okay, so what did we do first? What we did was we took all the CGF national action plans and we saw what were the revealed priorities from these CGF action plans. And there we saw that the first constraint to private sector development in the region seems to be access to capital. That was cited in 8 out of the 12 CGF action plans that we received. And those countries were very concerned, particularly with access to finance by SMEs or startups. Another big concern of almost also 8 of the countries that had CGF national action plans were to have better investment promotion instruments. 3 aspects were touched. One was the reform of the policy or legislative framework. Another was reform of the investment agencies so that they would be stronger. And another one also touched upon was tax incentive reform. A 3rd important issue were things related to land use, ownership, and property registration. And it was quite an important issue in 6 of the countries that developed CGF national action plans. A 4th issue, and this is not new to anybody who knows the region, is the high utility cost, particularly that of energy. And a 5th issue was business registration. This is not to say that other issues did not come up, but these were the most frequent ones. And since the CGF methodology is really about prioritization, these are the ones that we will delve with at this panel today. So what did we do kind of like after we saw what were the priorities of the CGF national action plans? We went to the Doing Business 2013 report put together by the World Bank to observe whether there was any alignment between the priorities that came up in the action plans and the Doing Business indicators. And indeed, there were. And it was very interesting to observe. Here I ordered them kind of in the same priorities that were revealed by the CGF national action plans. It was very interesting to observe that in getting credit, protecting investors, and registering property, the Caribbean region seems to be globally behind other countries in the world. The green line that you see in the middle is kind of like the middle ranking, and countries are better off if the lower on the y-axis that they are. Okay, so if they're from the middle line towards the bottom, their position in the world is higher than if they are from the green line towards the top. No? So there are several interesting things to note about this graph. First is that for some aspects of doing business, in the Caribbean there's a wide dispersion. So take, for example, starting a business, which was one of the things that were encountered in the CGF national action plans that was an issue of importance. That's the 5th one in orange. There we see that about maybe 60% of the countries are in the upper half of the world with respect to starting a business, and maybe 40% are not, no? But the ones that are not are doing very poorly. So in that case, there's a lot of opportunity for countries in the region to learn from other countries in the region about what they're doing well, okay? Now, there are some issues where all the countries are not doing that well. For example, registering property, which is the 3rd one. The best ranked country is Jamaica at 105, which means that there is a real difficulty in registering property in the region, okay? Okay. So here, I wanted to show you something else in the previous graph. Getting electricity in the region seems to be not that difficult. That means connecting to electricity, no? But as you may recall from the first slide, the cost of electricity is quite high. So here we compare the Caribbean average cost per kilowatt hour for a household to those households that have to pay for energy in Western Europe, Japan, and Scandinavia, and also the US. Western Europe, Japan, and Scandinavia are not regions known for low cost of energy. However, the Caribbean region, the cost of energy in the Caribbean region is 41% higher than for those regions. And it almost triples the cost of energy in the US. So that, well, okay. What were the key investment climate proposals that also came up in the CGF action plans? And there, many of them coincided in the same type of mechanisms as solutions to the problems that were identified. So to enhance access to finance, particularly to SMEs, ideas that were proposed were to implement a movable collateral framework and a registry of movable collateral, to implement credit bureaus or other mechanisms of sharing information, and to stimulate venture capital. To enhance investment promotion in the region, countries called to review the investment legislation, and issues that came up again and again were to improve the efficiency, equity, and transparency of that investment legislation. Many countries wanted specific instruments to support SME development, such as incubators, specialized capacity training for small firms, credit guarantee funds for small firms. Many countries called for investment instruments to make greater linkages to small and medium enterprises, particularly in tourism, and also targeted policies for promising growth sectors. And these promising growth sectors were found to be, depending on the country, agro-processing, agro-industry, offshore education for the Eastern Caribbean. For business and property registration, one-stop shops and simplified procedures, as well as e-governments, were the solutions proposed. And to reduce the energy costs, to implement energy commissions, to fraction the cost of linking to the utilities, and for the government to promote incentives that would make firms use more renewable energy or increase their energy efficiency. Okay, from what we have seen, what are the three opportunities for policy reform that are provided by this Caribbean Growth Forum? The first is sharing best regional practice, no? So we saw that in those places where the doing business indicators were quite dispersed, we could really learn from some countries in the region that were thought to be best practice. So for example, St. Vincent and the Grenadines ranks as 5th for obtaining construction permits. Trinidad and Tobago ranks as 23rd in the world for access to finance, where we saw that access to finance is a difficulty throughout the region, but Trinidad and Tobago is kind of an outlier. It also ranks 25th for protecting investors. Jamaica ranks 21st for starting a business. And well, it would be interesting to ask, how did they manage to do that, and are those models transferable to other countries in the region? The second thing that the Regional Caribbean Forum provides for those aspects where the region is behind as a whole is to bring international best practice. And here an example can be found in the APEC. APEC is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is a regional forum of 21 member economies. And it has as its primary goal to ensure sustainable economic growth and prosperity through voluntary cooperation. They set themselves a goal of making it 25% cheaper, faster, and easier to do business by 2015. And in the 3 years between 2009 and 2012, they reduced their doing business climate indicators, or they improved them by 11.5% on average. So that's a model that maybe the Caribbean can take. And then the third opportunity that the Caribbean Growth Forum provides is to cooperate regionally on some of the proposed solutions. For example, would it be perhaps more, would a regional credit bureau be more appropriate than a national specific one? Could there be a regional cooperation around investment promotion? The key question here is what regional solutions are appropriate in relation to the challenges that are identified by the national chapters. So now I introduce the distinguished panelists. Honorable Callis E. Roll, Minister of State for Investment, Office of the Prime Minister in the Bahamas. Mr. Michael Singh, who is Chief Executive Officer, that's the equivalent of a permanent secretary, at the Ministry of Investment, Economic Development and Trade of Belize. Mr. John Williams, Chief Executive Officer, Caven Shepherd and Company Limited. Mr. Jeffrey Hall, Chief Executive Officer, Jamaica Producers Group Limited. Mr. Alvin Wint, Chairman of the Regional Investment Promotion Steering Committee, and Mr. Rod Pennycook, who is a Chairman of the Royal Bank of Canada Financial Caribbean Limited. So now I sit down and I'll ask the panelists some questions. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So I would like to first ask the private sector members of our group, Mr. Jeffrey Hall and Mr. John Williams, about this constraint that we observed in the presentation of access to finance. So is this really the biggest constraint to private sector development in the region? Have you encountered it in your businesses? Has it inhibited the growth of your businesses? If you have encountered it, how have you addressed it? And also if you would provide a comment about whether the particular case of your businesses could be similar or different to businesses in other countries from which you operate, or of different sizes.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think that's 7 questions. And given our constraints on time, there's no question that access to finance, certainly in the Barbadian context, and I speak maybe more for the Southern Eastern Caribbean, is always a major issue. Particularly so for the medium-small, medium-sized enterprises, but actually growing more so even for established businesses. One of the issues here is that one of the fallouts of the financial crisis was that our banks have certainly been much more demanding in terms of security and collateral, even with established businesses. So even though you may have a very strong balance sheet, you have a strong track record of earnings, the demands for greater and greater security are increasing. I do hope that we will come back to a greater balance in the not too distant future, because it really is too far east is west in that regard. The other thing I would say is that there probably is an unrealistic expectation amongst some business persons, particularly in startup enterprises, for banks to be providers of equity capital. And that really is not the role of a commercial bank. And one of the things that we really have to focus on, and perhaps some of if you're saying Trinidad, and I'm not that familiar with their full capital markets, but we really have to do work in the areas of getting greater venture capital, angel investors, and startup providers, recognizing that it is high risk. Because if not, we will get caught in that endless cycle of saying the banks are not financing startups, and the banks almost by definition are saying, but you want us to be more and more careful with how we lend money, how we protect our balance sheet. So that is not our role.
Thanks, John. Sylvia, our group has a series of what I would call medium-sized businesses by international standards. Regionally, you might deem them to be larger businesses. But those businesses have borrowed money or accessed capital both within the region in places like Jamaica, but we've also had reason to borrow money in developed markets like the UK or Holland. And one insight that I would share with you is that the largest impediments to access to capital are probably outside of the financial system itself. And what I mean by that is that the requirements that a bank would ask for in a place like Holland of a medium-sized business are not dramatically different than the requirements that a bank would ask for in a place like Jamaica. They want to know that you have a stable set of cash flows and the capacity to repay. What makes it a challenge in the region is a whole series of problems that are not necessarily related to the financial sector. There is the justice system. There is currency risk. There is catastrophic risk, hurricanes. To solve the access to capital question requires you to have a fundamentally well-functioning enabling environment. Now, that said, there are a few things that are intrinsic to the financial system about which we can do something, and I would say they fall into three big buckets, and I would comment on them in the context of the work you're doing. One is information, and this is particularly applicable in relation to consumer finance and trade finance, but that matters even in the context of investment, because when we do a business that sells durable goods, we need to know that folks out there can access capital to buy them. The second bucket has to do with transactions costs. For example, in Jamaica, in order to use security, you have to pay a stamp duty equal to 3% of the value of the security. So when we borrowed about $10 million US last year, and the idea was that we were supposed to pay a transaction fee of $300,000 US. Now, that doesn't make any sense as a way of encouraging financial activity. And then the third bucket is exit, particularly in your SME sector. When you make that investment, folks need to find a way out. You spoke about best practices, Sylvia. Jamaica is experimenting with something called a junior market on the stock exchange, which is creating an opportunity for exit, and that's something that the region could begin to talk about.
Okay, now for the banker in our group. One, to corroborate the answers provided by the private sector. And second, I wanted to ask you what you think could be some immediate actions that can be taken to facilitate access to finance to firms across the region. Are the movable collaterals that are talked about, or credit bureaus, would they be good instruments? And what difficulties would you see in implementing those across the region?
Well, first of all, the customers are always right. So I think it's fair to say that Jeffrey and John actually hit a lot of the points that I had. I agree almost completely with everything they said. Maybe I can just fill in a few spaces. Since the recession hit in 2008, the biggest impact that we've seen in the financial industry is the hit to capital in firms of all sizes, but it obviously hit the small and medium-sized businesses the most. I mean, there's no question that the levels of capital have limited these companies from some of them sustaining themselves and others from growing. So there is absolutely a diminished level of capital throughout the region. At the same time, the financial institutions are actually very, very liquid. We've seen deposits go through the roof. A lot of the customers looking for safe haven as the economy has been going through the rocky road. So most banks and financial institutions are looking for good opportunities to invest. So it's not that they don't have the money, and it's not they don't want to invest. It's the number of opportunities that we're seeing, particularly in the small, medium size, that are just not there in some cases, and the other ones that come forward are not bankable. The comments about venture capital and angels is very true. However, that's a very difficult way to go to get that kind of capital to come in. From my perspective, what I've seen work in North America and Europe is something along the idea of a small business development bond. These are bonds that are backed by the government or institutions of some kind, many of which are here today, where these are allowed to go in to fund investments in infrastructure. They're typically not working capital. They're meant for development within any small, medium-sized business. I would see the banks administering and supporting a program like that quite easily, but without that kind of capital injection, I think a lot of these businesses just won't grow, and they will have some of them will have a difficult time succeeding. In terms of the environment to lend money in, and both John and Jeffrey alluded to it, the infrastructure around, whether it's the land registry system or credit bureaus, is just not what you see in North America and Europe, and therefore it does make it more difficult to assess whether you can make a loan. You know, Trinidad, I think, really is the only one with a credit bureau. Even that is only on the consumer side. It's not on the business side, so you need to look at how that can be fired up. I think there's almost no possibility that that can be done, you know, country by country. It needs to be done on a scale where the region looks at it because of the mobility within the region, and the companies are in different countries. Having a credit bureau in one country versus another sometimes doesn't get you very far. It does for very small business, but to the medium and the companies that are trading in other jurisdictions within the Caribbean, it doesn't go very far. Also, you need to get the scale so that the cost of putting these credit bureaus in is more reasonable. These are pretty expensive undertakings. The technology costs are massive, so you need to make sure you've got one plan that sort of would fit all. And I think credit bureaus aren't a hard thing. They're actually a fairly simple thing. And so the technology is one that I think if you get the scale, you'll save a lot of money. The same goes for land registry. It takes up to 1, 2, sometimes longer years to realize on security, let alone register security. So if you look at the models that are in other parts of the world where the land registry is digitized, at Royal Bank, we've tried to move this along, but there hasn't been much appetite in the Caribbean. But again, it's one of those things where you need convergence around the governments in the region to set it up so that you can do it cheaper and more efficiently. All those things would be very helpful. And the last one is the regulatory environment. Both John and Jeffrey alluded to it. The banks are under fairly significant pressure from the regulatory bodies, you know, to tighten up lending and you know, maintain our capital levels. And I think that's all well and good. However, in the Caribbean, I'm looking, in our case, we've got 12 central banks, the Monetary Authority in Cayman. They've all got different rules, and whether you're dealing with anti-money laundering or FATCA or any of these pieces, I think there's a huge opportunity to converge those pieces together. And I'm not talking from a monetary standpoint, currency, that's a step too far, but certainly in terms of regulatory approaches, I think there's a huge efficiencies and productivity that could be accomplished by looking at that area as well.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. So since we were talking about the land registries and property registries, I wanted to turn to our representatives from the public sector and ask, why is registering land and property so difficult in the Caribbean overall, and what can be done about it? And also, if movable collateral registries were implemented, would they face that same difficulty as well?
Yeah, Sylvia, I kind of wanted to touch on the finance thing for a second, if you don't mind. I'm also a director of our central bank, and I'm on the regulatory side as well. And clearly, since the financial crisis, the central banks have hunkered down, and they've tightened the rules on financial institutions to try to reduce the NPLs and non-performing loans on their portfolio, while trying to put in good lending practices to prevent. And it's been successful in that we've had very few bank failures within our region. I think a couple in Antigua and elsewhere. But for the most part, the banks have held. But that has brought a certain conservatism that has led to where you are today, where we've got excess capital in the system. We're finding that banks like Scotia, which are a bit more conservative, tend to have a lot lower NPL, while perhaps the indigenous banks are the ones that are hurting the most because they were more liberal during the liberal times. Now, how do we balance that where we can help the banks to get some of that excess capital out? I think that there's a mechanism that could be put in place. We're trying to encourage it in Belize to provide for establishment of investment mediators, fiduciaries that may not have the rules that banks have, but are able to move that capital and put it into projects that are in the productive sectors where better returns could be had. You guys from the banking sector know that you're not taking fixed deposits anymore. The days of getting the high returns where institutional investors were parking money, that is gone. So we have to have another outlet for that capital, and we're looking at ways of perhaps building some kind of a middle institution that can assess the risk, reveal the risk to the investor, and be able to be that middle fiduciary. So I think that can happen. And also, we part of the issue we have with bankability of projects is something that I don't think anybody brought up. There's a transparency issue on both sides, and in particular on the side of the borrower. It is very difficult to get audited financial statements that are credible within our region because there might be a shortage of auditors or perhaps an unwillingness to provide that kind of information. So the larger companies that are stronger, that may have accounting departments and are auditable, perhaps have an easier time, but the SMEs that can't afford to go through that process have a very hard time in providing the information. So there's a very hard time in giving them the kind of financing they want. So that transparency issue, I think, needs to be worked on from a corporate standpoint. We're trying to address it in Belize by setting up what we call the Small Business Development Center based on the US model through, I know Maurice is here, thanks Maurice, through assistance from the OAS and a few other, and the IDB and others. And we're now helping small firms to actually create the kind of financial statements that they can take into an institution to be bankable. And we're starting to see some success with that. So I wanted to just kind of touch on those points for a minute. On the land issue, in our case, the issue has a lot to do with previous practices of how land was distributed for political purposes. That's perhaps the number one reason why there's a difficulty, because the land registries were not operating quick enough to keep up with the issuances of land for people that apply to the government to buy land for development purposes. Now, there's also another issue, which is there's a heavy holding of land for speculative purposes, whereby, and a lot of it had to do with foreign investment in land banking. That has led to such a large corporate ownership in layers of corporations that it's very hard to track through ownership of land to be able to do those transfers very efficiently. So we have gone through a process of trying to establish an electronic lands registry, and that program has been going on for the last probably 4 years, and it's still not exactly where it needs to be. At the end of that program, we're hoping that we can speed up that process. The other issue we have is the issue of reporting true transaction costs. Often, buyers want to save money on their taxes, so you will never get a true number. So the process of going through a valuation by the lands department to be able to even understand that what you're claiming as the sale price for a land is real, that slows the process down as well. I think those are probably the major factor for us.
Thank you. Well, coupled with the issues that my colleague here just identified, I think one of the major issues the Prime Minister alluded to earlier in his speech when he said if you superimpose the map of the Bahamas over the Caribbean, the Bahamas is probably just as large as the Caribbean. So the uniqueness of our geography, how the islands are dispersed, makes it extremely difficult for us to have a system that is up to date and modern and that captures the essence of the land that is available. The process has been entirely a manual system over the years. And there was an initiative, if I remember correctly, supported by and financed by the IDB to establish an electronic registry for land. But, you know, to sum this up, it takes political will. It takes someone who understands sustainability to take this process and drive it to a conclusion. After the last election, the process just came to a grinding halt. And this is something that we recognize has tremendous value for long-term growth and sustainability in the Bahamas, and it's something that the current government is looking at reactivating, and hopefully we can get that done in short order to provide us with the long-term sustainability that we need, particularly during a challenging environment such as we exist now.
Thank you. I found that discussion very interesting, especially the land banking, which I think happens all over the Caribbean, no? Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to switch a little bit to investment and growth promotion policies and instruments, which was the second issue that came up in the CGF national plans. And I wanted to return to our public sector panelists to ask them that, considering the global recession and particularly the economic situation in the Caribbean, what are your views on the long-term economic development impact of fiscal incentives as instruments to foster investment? No? Are they effective in attracting new investments? Is it a sustainable practice? What can be done to increase their linkages, because they're usually given to very large firms? What can be done to increase their linkages to small and medium enterprises in the region?
Maybe I can kick off,
Okay.
Chair. But I'd like to take your question in a slightly broader framework, if that's okay, which is the broader issue of the extent to which there is a role for investment promotion across the region. And the incentives issue is one of those elements. But I think it's important to portray it in this broader picture because I think you can capture the various elements pretty well. When we first started trying to codify the structure and the orientation of investment promotion activities of governments 25 years ago, we divided investment promotion into three basic areas. One was image building, the extent to which a government, or in this case a group of governments, can come together to build the image of a region as a site for investment or a country. That's one. The second was investment generation, the specific targeted activities associated with trying to bring investment in or to create additional investment from local players. And the third was the whole area of investment service, the various ways in which governments would try to ensure that the process of investing was relatively smooth and easy. Well, as you look at these three areas, there is a potential regional role for all of them. If we start with investment promotion at the image building level, we can refer to the discussion that our Prime Minister started us off with. Are there opportunities to build the image of the Caribbean, broadly writ, as an attractive site for investment? I think this is something that needs to be considered very carefully, but we need a structure to consider that. The good thing about it is that we have tried to set up that structure. And so CARIFORUM and CARICOM have cooperated to create a regional investment promotion steering committee. And one of the tasks that our committee is currently engaged in is testing the extent to which investors perceive the region as a single space for economic and investment activity, and also in that process to get a sense of how they see the various countries in the region. What are their perceptions of those countries? We want to use that information to come up with the extent to which we can have a regional investment promotion strategy. We've already done an important study in that area. We'll be looking at that study more carefully at a meeting that we hope to have in Barbados in July to come up with possibilities for a regional investment promotion strategy. So that's at the image building side of things. And it's really important for us to think about how we do that, but we need the data, we need to understand how investors perceive the region. The second area of investment generation is where your incentive program issue comes in, Madam Chair. Because what countries have been doing in the last 30, 40 years of trying to attract investment, as they've sought to target investment activities, they've often, as a part of that process, engaged with investors in terms of concessions, as the Prime Minister described them, or incentives. We think there is a tremendous opportunity to engage far more effectively in harmonizing incentive programs across the region. This is not something new. CARICOM has had an incentive harmonization program on its books for many years, but we need to advance that process because it has not gone as smoothly and effectively as we would like to see. So another study that the Regional Investment Promotion Steering Committee is engaged in is a study that is benchmarking incentive programs, national incentive programs across the region to try to understand the extent of commonality and the opportunities for harmonization. It's interesting, the Prime Minister raised the same issue where he has indicated the Bahamas government is doing that similar kind of benchmarking activity. And we need to layers because, of course, the idea is to try to make sure that we don't end up duplicating efforts, but we learn from each other. And that issue of learning from each other takes me to the third area, investment service. How are we facilitating investment activity? Well, this is what was the essence of what our chair referred to in an examination of the doing business reports. Because when you look at the output from the national chapters, they're very interesting in terms of the challenges that are portrayed, but they don't allow us necessarily to understand where we are individually in terms of global practice. The doing business reports do allow us to do that because they contextualize what is happening in the region against international best practice. Now, this therefore represents potential areas of regional cooperation. If, and I just use some examples, Barbados is 28th in the world in resolving insolvency. Grenada, St. Kitts, and St. Vincent, based on the World Bank Doing Business report, are last in the world. Is there some sharing of best practice that is possible there? It seems it obviously is. If you take paying taxes, Jamaica is 163rd in the world. St. Lucia is 43rd. Jamaica should be understanding what St. Lucia is doing in terms of paying taxes, and we can do that in a coordinated regional framework. But we also, as the chair pointed out, have an opportunity to understand how as a region where we're doing badly, such as in the area of registering property, how we can learn from best in class in the world. And it seems to me that a regional solution to some of that best practice sharing and learning activity is an essential way forward for us. So what I would summarize and say, Madam Chair, is that I think that there are possibilities for regional cooperation. Obviously, we have a lot of work that we have to do at the national level, but those opportunities for regional cooperation have to involve a careful study of where we are as a region. And I think the good news is that we're actually trying to engage in that study almost as we speak.
Yeah, Sylvia, the regional effort, and I was involved with CAIPA for a period of time, looking at what they've been trying to do to bring the region together. But the challenges that CAIPA is the Caribbean Association of Investment Promotion Agencies. The issue that I found is that the different countries are all at different levels of where they need to be. So you always find that you can only go as fast as the slowest guy in the race. And by trying to get everybody to be on the same page, it tends to be unwieldy. If there's a regional program, for instance, to do some promotion, and certain countries might be ready and might be faster and willing to run, while others are behind, you can only go as fast as the slow guy. And that somehow, maybe that program needs to be looked at where there can be groupings like we do in COTED with the lesser developed and the more developed. On the incentive side, I listened to the Prime Minister this morning with a lot of interest because this is a challenge that we face all the time. There has to be a balance between how much you're willing to give and what you're going to get. But you're also racing against everybody else in the region. So it's a very, very hard balance. But there is an opportunity in respect to what will have to come with the changes coming from the WTO to ensure that certain incentives are rationalized. And I think the region should take advantage of that and perhaps do some kind of a regional program to say, let us while we're becoming WTO compliant on our subsidy packages or incentive packages, let's all do it at the same time. Because I think we do need to. It's extremely difficult when we're talking cooperatively at a table and then we go back to speak to an investor and we hear that somebody at the same table has offered something that the rest don't know about. And I think a comment was made this morning about the example of the discussing with the cruise lines. I remember sitting in meetings discussing all the hard stance that everybody will take in respect to making sure that the cruise lines have the same policy across the board, that head taxes are going to be the same, and we're going to stand up and we're going to demand employment, we're going to demand that they buy products from the region, and we sit in the meeting, everybody agrees to do it, and the cruise lines walk in, and everybody has a whole different story, almost immediately. and to make it worse, during the same meeting, I think Carnival canceled a ship going into Antigua, and Antigua just decided we're not even going to say anything because we may lose another ship. So the bargaining power that these lines have is extremely important. And the one thing that I would suggest is that if we wanted to have strength in numbers and be able to deal regionally on issues like this, perhaps we need to start aligning a bit more with Central America and Latin America, because they have the numbers for bargaining power, which we don't. There's a fundamental issue in respect to promoting investments in the Caribbean, and it has to do with market size. Market size it holds back the ability for any serious investor to come in and to say that they will build a base on a local market and then move forward. So we are at that disadvantage. So we are limited to only attracting those investors that see us as an advantage, either fiscally, perhaps for a natural resource, or for a location. Outside of that, we have no local market to give them. So perhaps we need to start aligning with those neighbors of ours that have a market, and to be able to offer more of a regional context. And I think we could build regional type incentive packages along that line along with them as well. So
a quick follow-up, because I think the point is so important. So much of our discussions of regionality have avoided realism. And I think it's extraordinarily important as we go forward that we incorporate realism, including bargaining power issues, into our discussions of regionality. So we don't see regional solutions at an emotional level, but we see them at a practical, realistic level. I think it's absolutely critical. And again, it's the point I made that even when we're contemplating a regional investment promotion strategy, we're trying to inform it with data, and we want it to be as realistic as possible. And because we've had too much of the orientations to regionalism that actually don't link effectively with reality, and we have to change that.
I like the term realism, and you know, one of the things that the very difficult question that has to be answered is how do you run a relay with your competitor? And that's essentially what we're asking when we talk about regional investment promotion. And you made a very good point in that every country isn't at the same level in terms of investment promotion and their capacity and frankly for what they have to offer. And one of the things that we've done in the Bahamas is we've looked at what else is taking place throughout the Caribbean and try to develop a system that allows us to focus on competitive advantage, one, but also comparative advantage, because that's the only way you're going to get something out of a system that offers something from the outside that everybody sees as one. You have a Caribbean that offers sun, sand, and sea. When someone talks about the Bahamas, they talk about Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad in the same light. I guess Trinidad has the advantage in that it's heavily industrial based. And what was interesting, I had dinner yesterday with a very large investor who made the distinction between the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos and said that there is a major difference between the two, and it's the weather. And I think the Prime Minister mentioned earlier that the Turks and Caicos is just an extension of the Bahamas. And one can imagine hearing from an investor that there is a distinct difference between the weather in the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. And I asked him to define that a little more for me. And he said, well, it rains a lot more in the Bahamas, one, and it's a lot colder during the winter. And I'm still trying to rationalize that. But in terms of investment incentive, you know, it goes back to competitive advantage and comparative advantage. Sometimes the only thing you have to offer is investment incentives. In our case, what we've done is we're heavily concentrated in the resort sector. So we see that as a competitive advantage, and it gives us a bargaining chip. It gives us a tool that we can use with investors and say, we don't have to give you as much as you're asking for. If you go somewhere else, we already have the physical plant, we already have the market. We're located 50 miles off the coast of Florida, so we're an extension of the United States. So if you look at the shipping lanes, you look at the sailing lanes for the cruise lines, we're the first stop, we're the last stop. And that's why I think we have been able to benefit tremendously. And it's good and it's bad. You know, we're battling with the same issue when the cruise lines step up to the table. They use the divide and conquer mentality or approach. And we're seeing that recently. We're going through some negotiations with them, and it's not going in their favor. So they called the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago and told him that they're pulling a ship out of Nassau and Freeport. Many years ago, I'm still relatively young, so I can say that in the context of 3 or 4 years. But it may have been about 5 years ago, I sat down with a regional group to talk about how best we deal with the cruise lines. And one of the suggestions made, particularly from an incentive standpoint, we were negotiating an overnight incentive with the cruise lines. And I sat down with a regional group and said that we need to form a regional port management company. So every port in the Caribbean falls under one umbrella. So the cruise lines cannot come to the Bahamas and say, we're going to put 3 ships here, and go to Jamaica and say, we're going to put 2 ships there, and they put us in a position where we're competing to offer more liberal incentives than we reasonably should. And the idea, you talk about realism, the idea never got beyond that table, because the cruise lines were able to go in and say, this is what we're going to offer. And for a country, you're going to receive 1 million more tourists a year. That's a major incentive. What more incentive can you ask for? You know, we're in a position, the reality is, get back to that word, you're in a position where the more foreign direct investment, the more tourists you receive, the better your national development, the place in the context will be. So we have to find a strategy based on competitive advantage, but also based on comparative advantage that will allow us to negotiate a lot better, that will allow us to develop incentive packages that are not onerous to the state, that are not onerous to our development, and put us in a better position to get what we want out of this challenge that we currently face.
Okay, I wanted to turn the microphone to John Williams, who wants to talk about investment promotion mechanisms, no? And whether they are the adequate mechanisms right now for the private sector in the region.
Thank
Is it on?
Thank you. The conversation, Mike, that you started, and Minister and so on, is so interesting, because it's what we face every day in the business community, because a customer comes into my store and says, I can get that 1 carat diamond ring cheaper down at your competition. And unfortunately, laws have been passed that means that I can't get together with my competition and say, this is the maximum discount. So what happens then is exactly what you're explaining. Actually, Prime Minister alluded to, you have to get that balance of negotiation and to know what is the value that you're offering, the point that you're making. I think 2 important things from my perspective. I do not think it is realistic to think that we're going to move away entirely from offering concessions to foreign direct investment, and in fact to local investment, but it has to be targeted in the areas that we want it to be. I think it has to have a level of transparency that both at the political level and the country level we can stand up and say this is what we're doing. And Importantly, we have had to offer these concessions often because the business environment, the facilitation is not strong enough. So almost we're at a position of a disadvantage where we're having to offer those incentives to make up for other failings in our whole business operating environment. And I would like to see, I think that when you look at the successful countries in the world that can pick and choose, and whether you're talking Singapore and so on, they only need to offer concessions in critical areas, sectors, industries that they want to attract. But they don't, generally established industries, they don't have to do it. And we are still having to do it in areas that we're established in. The one other thing, and as we're talking business facilitation and came out of the survey, was the one-stop shop. And again, I say that I think a one-stop shop is important for a new investor arriving in your territory who doesn't know how everything works, because they don't want to have to, it would take them months, if not longer, to learn how all the various players interact and so on. So giving someone that ability is equivalent of when you walk into this hotel and there's the information desk that can get it. Unfortunately, a lot of our discussion of one-stop shops in the Caribbean region have come about because of inefficiency and lack of business facilitation. So suddenly people are saying, it takes ages. They know what the process is, but it takes ages, and therefore what we're doing is we're putting a plaster on the sore by getting a one-stop shop. And I think that for that latter purpose, that's the wrong approach.
I'd just like to comment on the one-stop shop issue, because it's not a new issue. Again, it's something that was studied as long ago as 25 years ago. And as we did some of that work looking at organizations to try to create an investment authority that was completely responsible for all approval processes, more often than not, these became one more stop shops. Because with the best will in the world, the regulatory responsibilities were never fully transferred. And so in addition to going to the supposed one-stop shop, you still also, as an investor, ended up having to go to the entities where the real power resided. And so it's very, very important to focus on the broader issue of not the plaster, but the transformation of government so that the entire government structure becomes more facilitatory. With your investment promotion agencies playing an evangelical role in getting that process organized and structured. It's very, very important. It's the same issue about having investment promotion agencies reporting directly to the Prime Minister so that they give them more authority. Often it creates even greater resentment on the part of other governmental agencies who then also go about seeking to demonstrate where the real power lies. So I think we have to look at these issues both in the context of research that has been done, and there's a lot of research on investment promotion, and also in the context of really trying to have this much broader based approach to business facilitation. And again, I think the World Bank's assistance in the Doing Business reports is helping us, because if you look at the spread of business facilitation issues that are developed on in that report, it's very, very wide. And I think that message has been captured. And I think a number of governments, and I think a number of governments have been doing very well in terms of that broader process of business facilitation. The other point to make there, of course, is that investment promotion is as important for your local investors as it is for foreign, and too often our approaches have been focused only on foreign investment, and you need a much broader based process there. So that's the only cautionary note. Let's not make the one-stop shops one more stop shop.
Yeah, I just want to say two things. One, I get your point. I can say amen to the point about having the investment promotion agency resident in the Prime Minister's office and being able to get things done relatively easily. That's not the case. There is a certain amount of resentment as a result of that. And then the second one, I'm getting old now. What was the second one? No, I think the second point with actually ensuring that the downstream benefits as a result of foreign direct investment flows throughout the economy. In the Caribbean, we haven't done a good enough job of that. In the Bahamas, we haven't done a good enough job of that. You know, in 2011, we received $1.5 billion worth of foreign direct investment. And per capita, that was the largest among small island developing states. The second to that, I think, was Trinidad and Tobago. But if you look at the downstream benefits to SMEs, it's non-existent. You know, more SMEs closed during that period or were impaired during that period than any single period throughout our history. And that was a result of not having adequate policies in place, not having modern policies in place to ensure that the benefit flows throughout the economy. And one of the things that we're doing in the Bahamas and in the Bahamas Investment Authority, tomorrow afternoon we will sign a technical cooperation with the IDB to establish an economic development unit as part of the Bahamas Investment Authority in the Office of the Prime Minister. And this will also lead to an economic development plan, which is absent. But this will help us to map out the steps that we need to take to ensure that when we receive $1.5 billion foreign direct investment, the small business owners, the medium-sized business owners can walk with their heads high and can be proud and can be functioning and performing indicative of receiving $1.5 billion in the economy.
I don't know how we're doing for time, Andrea, but if we have 10 more minutes left, I didn't want to finish the panel without discussing energy. Yes? Do we have the time? No? Do we have the times? 2 minutes. Okay. So being energy is such a high cost in the region, and I guess I will give it to the one that raises his hand first. I wondered what private businesses could do to reduce their energy costs, whether there are financing instruments available for firms to reduce their energy costs, and what the public sector can do regulatory-wise to reduce the cost of energy in the region. So maybe what I will do is like take one of each and 1 minute, please, okay?
The energy, renewable energy has been pushed so hard, particularly by many of the agencies in this region as really the solution to a lot of this, but a lot of times it's not realistic. It's a little bit difficult to make that switch when many times the technology is not perfected, and many times it actually works out to be more expensive. One of the things we've done in Belize is that we have actually put together a new energy policy that lays out exactly how we want to see energy not only as for domestic use but also as a potential export. We're blessed with a lot of natural rivers and waterways and a lot of bioactivity with being able to produce either by growing plants or using bio-waste for fuel. So we are looking at tying into the grid within Central America. It's called the CPAC grid. Currently we buy a lot of our power from Mexico, and we're a link to be able to transfer that power into Central America using our distribution. So our policy is speaking to an export market, it's speaking to the renewable market, and also to be able to use what we have currently more efficiently. And within that, there's some incentives built. I know my minute is out. But the caution that we have is that many times we're being given a lot of assistance in trying to develop the renewable model, and it's very difficult. I think it's not as easy. It's very sexy to say it, but when you really get into it, it's not so easy.
Point taken.
So, yeah, obviously the issue of energy costs is very topical throughout the region, in part because of the scale of the economies and the structure of the economies results in high electricity costs. And then there's a separate discourse that's particularly current in Jamaica about the relative energy costs between Trinidad and other parts of the Caribbean. In our business, which we do food manufacturing and some logistics, terminal operations, what you find is that the electricity cost by itself is not per se that material within the business. So in a food manufacturing business, you have the raw material input, which is a big chunk of it, and labor. Maybe electricity is 3 or 4%. Now, your profit margin in a food business is also 3 or 4%, so that can go wrong if it's materially higher. But what really matters is not just our electricity bill, but the impact as it flows through everything else that the economy does. Because obviously if the worker has to go home and pay for their fridge, then that runs up the labor bill. And obviously if there's a cold storage facility, then their bill is up, and so that it ripples through the entire production system. The reason I mention that is that it's not simply about me putting a windmill on top of my manufacturing facility or a solar panel, because I might get my energy down, but then the wider economic cost is still impacted. So this is going to be one of these areas where we're going to have some kind of public policy solution to really make a difference. And in the case of Jamaica, it's going to be about getting the fuel source right and getting control of what we call systems losses. And those are big public policy activities that will require the involvement of people in this room. And it's obviously quite topical.
Just to close on this, Michael's absolutely right. There's all kinds of financing products for traditional petrochemical hydro. That's kind of average state-of-the-art stuff. When you get to solar and wind, solar in California, where the biggest solar farms are in Arizona, they're all subsidized by the government. So in the desert, they have, I hate to say it, but more sun than the Caribbean, hotter and longer. And the wind farms, which are also the largest in California and Arizona, are subsidized, not as much. But I'm not sure I'm seeing wind farms in the various countries in the Caribbean as if you're trying to attract tourists. It's not a great sight.
The only point I'd add there, and we're actually starting to see it, certainly in Jamaica, is that the technology in terms of prices is beginning to change to make this more of a possible future, energy future for us. And so we are starting to see a whole business development process around solar technology in Jamaica. We're seeing more residential consumers move in that direction. We're seeing payback periods of 10 years or less. And those could be even heightened for commercial carriers. But it's going to, Jeffrey's right, it's going to require a system-wide process. But let's not throw out renewables. There are real possibilities, and I think the technology is actually going to be coming down in price. So it has to be a part of the mix, but a part of the mix. It's not the sole solution.
Thank you, distinguished panelists. This was a great panel, and I really value your contributions. Thank you.